The internet is a Rorschach test for hate. If you've seen my other videos, I encourage you to pursue your interest regardless of what others may think. Since there's always going to be someone willing to pee in your cereal bowl, I don't want them to discourage you from pursuing your happiness, so sit back, relax, and enjoy this video where I scientifically prove that haters are full of shit. And not just any haters, mind you. We're going to focus on my very own haters from a video where I propose that ancient Egyptians may have known about electricity. While that video was overwhelmingly liked, just like this comment, the best explanation of the real porpoise of the Great Pyramid that I've heard until now. Today we're going to dunk on the haters. Here are some of those comments. Doesn't ring true. Conspiracy theory. 3 comparisons to crap. I love this one. Absolute drivel. This guy felt so passionately about it he commented twice. Let me explain why your opinions mean very little to me by telling you a story. Once upon a time there was a guy named Ignaz Semmelweis. In English, Semmelweis translates to white bread roll, so naturally we'll call him Breadboy. Anyways, Breadboy is the hero of our story. He starts a new job in Vienna where he's assistant to Professor Johann Klein. Klein is a German word for small, so naturally we'll shrink him. There are 2 clinics at this hospital and they're both maternity wards. One is ran by doctors and the other is ran by midwives. Midwives are nurses who deliver babies. One clinic has a higher mortality rate. Now, common sense would make you think that the one ran by midwives had the higher mortality rate because they aren't doctors, but you'd be wrong. Breadboy starts looking into the differences between the 2 clinics. He charts the 2 clinics, and the data confirm that there was absolutely something different and something very, very bad happening at the doctor's clinic. He takes a look at multiple aspects to find out what those differences are. In the one maintained by doctors, a priest walked through and rang a bell as a last sacrament to the dying women. Breadboy wondered if women were dying because of the psychological terror of hearing the bell, so that even though they're not dying, they hear the bell and they think, oh no, it's my time. Breadboy reroutes the priest. Go ring your bell outside. No difference. The women still kept dying. The little professor told him to stop looking into it and to focus on his daily rounds instead, but Breadboy just couldn't let it go. One of Breadboy's colleagues was performing an autopsy one day, and he cut his finger on a scalpel while doing so. He soon developed a fever and died, and his symptoms looked exactly like how the women were dying. Breadboy wondered if a similar type of infection was happening at the doctor's maternity ward. The doctors were performing autopsies on these dead women, and the midwives weren't. So maybe this is related. Breadboy wondered maybe there's little particles of dead matter that's getting transferred from the doctors to the patients. The physicians were using their bare hands to deliver babies and to perform autopsies. Spoiler alert, they weren't washing their hands between the 2 procedures. It sounds icky today, but it was the style at the time. No one knew about germs back then. He just told the doctors to wash their hands with a chlorinated solution until the smell of putrefaction from that dissection was no longer detectable. Within months, the results of this simple hygienic change were apparent and astounding. The maternal mortality rate dropped to 1 or 2%, matching that from the midwives' ward. I'd love to tell you that this is how Breadboy became Breadman, the savior of mothers. After all, you'd think that everyone would be thrilled. Breadboy had solved everyone's problem. But people weren't thrilled. To some of Breadboy's colleagues in the medical community, it sounded crazy to imply that doctors were dirty and that people dedicated to helping patients were the very ones hurting them was just something that they weren't willing to accept. Despite various publications of results where hand washing reduced mortality to below 1%, Breadboy's observations conflicted with the established scientific and medical opinions of the time, and his ideas were rejected by the medical community. He could offer no acceptable scientific explanation for his findings. Many doctors refused to look at his data, but instead they mocked him with insults like Arschgeige, which means ass fiddle, and yep, that's an actual German insult. This one not so much, but it was too good to leave out. This was in 1847, decades before germ theory. For over a millennia, it was believed that odors carried disease. Nowadays, we look back with disbelief that something as fundamental, basic, and primitive as washing a person's hands would be looked at in such a negative way, and yet it was. So what does this story of hand washing have to do with haters on the internet? The most sophisticated and well-respected people of the time let their opinions override science. They said things like, it doesn't ring true, or equated the idea to crap. They refused to look at his data. They thought he was naive, and that his conclusion was an exaggeration, and his theory was crazy. To sum it up, they thought that hand washing to prevent disease was absolute drivel. This has been a pattern with humanity since like forever. Abraham Ortelius suggested continental drift way back in 1596. It was proposed many times since then, even as late as 1912 when it was proposed by Alfred Wegener. It was still ridiculed by fellow scientists. The American Association of Petroleum Geologists organized a symposium specifically in opposition to the continental drift hypothesis. It would take another 50 years for the concept to be accepted. Science gives zero fucks about your symposium. Then there was the tag team of Copernicus and Galileo, who championed that the sun was the center of our solar system. Copernicus delayed the publication for fear of how the Catholic Church would react. Galileo compiled a lot of evidence for Copernicus's theory, which really pissed off the church. I know that the church isn't gonna like this, and I don't care. We don't like this. The church dragged their feet, but ultimately acknowledged that maybe observing the heavens rather than reading about it may have prevented them looking like a bunch of bitches. Darwin comes along and tells everyone that their ancestors were a bunch of monkeys, which of course went over really well. His hater was Lord Kelvin. Now you may remember him as the guy we talked about in the previous video. He made the thunderstorm device that generates electricity by falling water droplets. You probably also learned about him in school as the temperature guy, 0 degrees Kelvin. Now you don't want to be on the opposite side of Lord Kelvin in an argument because this guy was smart. Like ridiculously smart. He was an extremely accomplished professor of physics for over 50 years and achieved numerous accomplishments and held many awards. But he also said that airplanes would be impossible. He also didn't believe in X-rays, so there's that. And you know this guy, right? His critics published a book called 100 Authors Against Einstein, stating that the speed of light is the same for all observers regardless of their relative motion just doesn't ring true. It doesn't track in any way to our day-to-day observations on how things work. And if that wasn't a hard enough pill to swallow, you also have to acknowledge that a second of time isn't the same everywhere in the universe, which creates a lot of logical problems about the timing of events. It's just a lot of contradictions to common sense. Shall I go on? We had known about ulcers for hundreds of years. It was common knowledge that they're caused by high stress and spicy foods. Restrictive diets were prescribed to keep the symptoms at bay, and of course, billions of dollars of medications were given. Not to cure the problem, but to temporarily fix the symptoms. That is, until Barry Marshall. He's an Australian doctor who determined that ulcers were caused by bacteria. By this time, we had known that bacteria was the cause of disease for over 100 years. Other scientists and doctors with their big brains said that bacteria couldn't survive in the stomach's acid, and his research paper was rejected. Then, like a baller, he drank that bacteria and gave himself an ulcer. That blew everyone's nips off. And we all know that Adolf Hitler was ultimately proven to be... Wait, what the... Sorry about that. Looks like I need a new intern. I can go on and on telling you more of these stories. Here's a few more, then we'll just wrap this up. I could also tell you about Lynn Margulis, Carl Sagan's ex-wife, who had her paper rejected 15 times because scientists refused to believe that mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, was caused by bacterial symbiosis. These so-called stupid ideas weren't merely downvoted by internet randos. They came from people who were believed to be the experts. Finally, let's meet the father of taxonomy, Carl Linnaeus. He studied, categorized, and established scientific names for literally thousands of plants and animals. This guy's the reason we're known as Homo sapiens. People would send him plants and animals from all over the world to add to his system. He literally wrote the book on life. Let's see his facial reactions to learning about the platypus. Hey Carl, we found a new mammal. It's like a beaver. It has a duck's bill. It lays eggs. It's venomous. It glows under blacklight. It can detect electric fields. And it has 10 sex chromosomes. These people were smart, so where did they go wrong? They used substitutes for science. They felt confident to the point of arrogance with their assumptions. Logic is one such substitute. Being logical is considered smart, so it's a good thing, right? Meet the mighty logic, also known as the god of conventional wisdom and common knowledge's son. This is science's lazy teammate. Since he thinks he's smart, he can skip a lot of the steps in the scientific method. He doesn't need to research or put much thought into a hypothesis. He's definitely not going to experiment. He's got the gist of what's going on, and that's good enough. Basically, he can skip directly to reporting his own conclusions without all that fussy scientific business. Frequently, he'll add this extra step just to remind everyone around him that they're all a bunch of dummies, because that helps to support this narrative. Sometimes he gets it right. Is there a stale potato chip between the couch cushions? He isn't okay with being wrong, because that invalidates his identity. Now meet science. Sometimes he gets it wrong, but he's okay with being wrong, because it's part of the process in learning. Because logic is lazy, it takes shortcuts, but logic will only be effective if it has enough information. But it probably never will. Here's why. Imagine a circle that contains all of human knowledge. Here you are when you're very young, looking at your baby Einstein developmental videos, learning about shapes and colors. Eventually you go to high school. You have a well-rounded education. Congratulations, you're a teenager, and now you think you know everything. Maybe you go to college. This little bump is your area of focus. Maybe you get a master's degree. You read research papers which take you right up to the edge of what we know. You keep pushing against that boundary. Then one day, you make a breakthrough and earn a PhD, and all of humanity benefits by your effort, pushing that boundary out a bit further. Many of the haters aren't operating at this level. Maybe they're here. Sometimes they aren't even in the right speciality. Interesting though, they're all too happy to say how others are wrong. And even if your areas of expertise are perfectly aligned and overlap with that other person, keep in mind that you still don't know much. Your logic is operating in this area right here. Ultimately, we grow as a species by challenging conventional wisdom. Sometimes we get it wrong along the way. We've been trained since school that failure should be avoided, but I'll point out that Elon Musk has failed to send more rockets into space than more of all of you watchers combined, as long as Elon doesn't watch this video himself. Failure is more than okay. It's often necessary to progress. What should be avoided is not trying at all. And if you have no interest in trying, you can still help to push this boundary outward by stop being so critical, especially when relying upon logic, common sense, or literally anything else instead of the scientific method. Oh, and do a bit of research before telling others what's impossible. Don't be a dick. How about some bonus content? This is completely unrelated to the video. We'll answer some of your questions from the ancient Egyptian electricity video. If you want to watch that video first, click the card in the upper right. It'll be nice to move on from those logic traps and briefly discuss a new theory at the end. This guy's talking about how the idea proposed in my previous video couldn't be true. If you decide to build such an enormous structure for a specific task, you do not doubt if it'll work. You are absolutely sure it'll work. Well, that seems logical. Ah, crap. Logic again. I thought we agreed to move on. All right, let's just make this quick. This is an enormous structure which had a specific task, and yet it did not work. This is the failed ancient Egyptian pyramid at Meidum. Still not convinced that it's completely possible to invest a lot of time and effort into something that doesn't work out as planned? Look up the bent pyramid as well. The Egyptians ended up changing the angle mid-construction due to failure. In short, history just doesn't work the way that you think it should. Let's try that bonus content again. It'll be nice to move on from these traps of logic, common sense, and conventional wisdom that humanity still can't help falling into. Archaeology is the study of data, not theory. Logic again? You're getting the double facepalm for that one. How about this? Don't take it from me this time. Take it from Mark Lehner, archaeologist at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago and Harvard's Semitic Museum. Virtually all information in archaeology is circumstantial. We're not dealing with any one foothold of factual knowledge at Giza itself. All right, can we all agree to stop using logic now? You can't spell logic without I clog, as in I clog up my brain with BS. Okay, third time's the charm. Someone out there cross your fingers so we can get out of this rut. I'm running out of facepalm memes. Back when the pyramid was built, would the celestial map be different possibly? So that at one time in the distant past, maybe the shafts did align with a star. Harvard partnered with NASA to test this very idea. The short answer is that there was no time in history when the shafts would have aligned with all of the proposed stars. Now, if you're okay with not having stars align with the shafts at the same time, then yes, over time, the shafts will eventually align with a star. But keep in mind that it's impossible to construct a building in which some aspect of it doesn't align with some star or another. If you look at the shafts, you'll notice that they all exit at the same height, which implies that the goal was symmetry and not astronomy. Rodney says, it belongs in an Egyptian museum. Not anybody else's. He's talking about the artifacts which were found in the shafts. At the time that I filmed the previous video, the wood was lost. And since that time, it was rediscovered and it exists in another country's museum. Well, Rodney, relics aside, I guess you should be happy that the pyramids still exist at all in Egypt, but only because they were too big to be taken by the British. Britain, get wrecked. Oh yeah! You can't steal it if it belongs to your empire. We are not part of your empire anymore. Can we have our stuff back, please? Absolutely not. This is ridiculous. American YouTuber, didn't you steal your entire country? Moving on. Maybe it's the opposite. Our ancestors were more developed than us. There are two camps on this advanced ancient knowledge and technology argument. One side sees hieroglyphs like this and interprets helicopters. The other side believes that progress happens in a more, dare I say it, logical way? Actually, the truth is a weird tinfoil hat wearing combination of both. I'll give two examples. You remember these two founding fathers of heliocentrism, right? Now meet Aristarchus of Samos. He's the guy that came up with heliocentrism something like 1,700 years before Copernicus. His works were lost, and we only know about him since Archimedes mentioned him. Aristarchus stated that the Earth revolves around the sun once per year, and it rotates on its axis once a day. He stated that the sun was much larger than the Earth and the other planets. He put the other planets in their correct order of the distance around the sun. Aristarchus suspected that the stars were just other bodies like the sun, albeit much farther away. He estimated the sizes of the sun, the moon, as well as their distances from the Earth. Here's the Antikythera mechanism. It's a geared computer used to determine astronomical positions and eclipses decades in advance. It would also keep track of the cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. The device is expected to have been created around 100 BC. The quality and complexity of this mechanism suggests that there were even earlier devices like this which have been lost to us. Works with similar complexity didn't appear again until the development of mechanical astronomical clocks in Europe, over 1,400 years later. Logic would tell us that technology and knowledge progress over time, but it just isn't as simple as that. Steve is trying to piggyback on this topic, so let's see what he has to say. If the Egyptians had known about electricity, they would have used it everywhere, not just in the pyramids, and yet no evidence of such thing. Jesus fuck. God damn. With a camel. You're getting the dreaded triple face palm for that one. There is no greater badge of shame. We just talked about the Antikythera mechanism. Using your logic, if the ancient Greeks had known about geared mechanisms, they would have used it everywhere, not just in this single artifact, and yet no evidence of such thing. For the record, replying to a person like this is like playing chess with a pigeon. No matter how good your replies are, they just knock over pieces, crap on the board, and strut around like they won. How about a new theory? This is the third pyramid at the Giza plateau. It's the smallest one. An odd feature about it is that about a quarter of the way up, it's covered in red granite, and the rest is all white limestone. We see one course of red granite on Khafre, the middle pyramid, and we see no granite at all on Khufu. So why so much granite on Menkaure versus the other pyramids? I reached out to my archaeologist friend, Peter Emanuelian, who's the director of the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. He mentioned two theories. The first is that Menkaure was flexing on his predecessors by using a more difficult stone from a more distant location. Let's examine that for a moment. If the Menkaure pyramid was as large as the other two and also covered with granite, I tend to agree. But given that it's greatly diminished in size, it doesn't really stand out as showing off to me. The second point he mentions is that granite offered greater protection. This seems more likely, but it does beg the question why Khafre only went with a single row of granite. If it was protection from grave robbers, it'd be rather trivial to break into the next higher course. Another YouTuber has recently suggested that it offered protection from flash flooding, but it seems to me like it'd be a lot easier to dig channels to redirect the water flow from those higher elevations than to quarry and transport this extremely hard and heavy stone with the tools that they had. Here's what we do know. Khufu's pyramid stands the tallest and it has no granite casing. Further to the west, Khafre's pyramid is slightly smaller and has a single row of red granite. Further west still, Menkaure's pyramid is substantially smaller and has many rows of red granite. Could it be that the builders intended the pyramids to represent the sun, and Menkaure's pyramid is smaller because it's a setting sun? The lower the sun goes, the more pronounced this coloration is on the horizon. I'll point out too that the ancient names of the 4th dynasty pyramids seem to indicate this. Seneferu shines in the south, Seneferu shines in the north, Khufu's horizon, Jedfrey's Starry Sky? Just like my previous video on Egypt, I'm only speculating. I can't say for sure, and I know I'm only operating within this tiny circle. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Please comment below. I cannot get the vision of Kermit the Frog doing the narration out of my head. Holy crap, they've discovered my secret identity. Well, only one thing to do now. Hi-ho, Kermit the Frog reporting to you about ancient Egypt. If you liked this video, or at least learned something new, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't learn anything and hated it, then downvote it. But just know that I'm plotting your doom. If you want to see more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel and ringing the bell. I read most of the comments. Maybe just tell me hi-ho. I hope to see you in the next one.